right, here we go. Episode 19 of The Drop in the house. Oh, coming in hot on Thursday night, October 1st, August. I'm already, that's where my head is at.
It feels like August.
Oh my God, MK, I feel like I am in January already. It's been 3 weeks back to work.
I know.
And, oh my goodness.
Well, we're in October. We're in October.
We are in October. And you know what I love about October the most? It's that gateway to hoodie season.
Yeah, we both got them on.
Rocking the hoodies. It is starting to get a little, the air is starting to change. And
yeah.
We love the gateway into the holiday season and fall season and pumpkins and cider and all that good stuff.
Best time of the year.
Best time of the year. Hopefully we get to experience some of it without it being too overwhelming. We got to figure that out.
Exactly.
Rough. What is going on this week with you, my friend?
Nothing much, really. I mean, I feel like we're kind of getting into the swing of things in the classroom again. I mean, there's still those difficult things and that we have to deal with, and I feel like we're making do, which is good, and we're moving forward, and we're doing our best, and I think that's the best that we could do.
I think so. I don't think we'll ever feel 100% ourselves.
No.
As long as this whole thing stays the way it's been, I think that for us, as hands-on, tactile type of teachers, I think that this has been a huge challenge for us. And I know for me, my fear is that I don't want to lose their interest. I don't want it to be, for lack of a better term, as ironic as it sounds, it is sterile.
Yeah.
The way we're handling things, both literally and figuratively.
Absolutely.
But it's an experience that I don't want it to become something where the kids are turned off from it because they know it's not the norm.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for us is that to keep art, that special class, out of their schedule. That's the challenge. It's very easy now that it could kind of fall into line with the other classes in their schedule. But one of the challenges that I think that we face is keeping the special, which is art, special, even under these circumstances.
Right, exactly. And I think that's going to continue to be the challenge down the road, is keeping it fresh, keeping it, like you said, special, keeping it fun, keeping it safe. We want them to have that safe space, that place to come and just lose themselves in their own heads and focus on what makes them feel good about themselves and their ability levels. And we have a fantastic guest this week, a throwback, an artist who also teaches, but who is a firm believer in being tactile and getting your hands in it, and just an amazing experience talking to this gentleman and his knowledge of history.
Yeah, right? It was a great, I mean, I don't want to brag, but it was a great interview, a very eye-opening one for us, and one that I think that we both learned a tremendous amount from.
Oh man, I didn't think we could top the last one, and I think we topped it. If you are a fan of art history and you are someone who appreciates the nuances of the entire experience, I think you're going to be in for a treat. Strap on in and just enjoy the ride, because this was a fantastic episode. MK, let's get this sucker rolling. All right, here we go. We have with us today Joe Fig, straight from Sarasota, Florida. We are excited. MK and I have been following this guy for, what is it? Since I picked up this incredible book, one of two critically acclaimed books by our featured guest today. It was, let me say, I believe, Joe, it was 2009,
I believe.
2009, yeah.
Wow,
I picked up this book right when it came out. So I've been on the Joe Fig bandwagon since 2009. And MK and I were just talking about it before we started the program. What was that? I showed you.
You showed me when you found him on social media a little bit while back. The sculptures of the interiors of the studios.
Right. And then I realized that when we were talking about it again, that I have a exhibition poster of Joe's in my classroom. and I believe it's a shot of Pollock's studio. Joe, do you remember that exhibit?
From the Nassau County Museum.
That's what you said. That's what you said. Yeah.
And I thought that's where it was from. I remember being in the gift shop and saying, this is the coolest looking thing. And at first I thought it was a photo of Pollock's studio. And then when I looked at the name and then I looked them up later on, I was like, oh my God, this is not a photograph of the studio. This is a replica of Pollock's studio, which is exactly what we're going to talk to Joe about today. He is a local boy from Seaford, Long Island. Yeah. So we're going to get to Joe's, what we like to call the origin story of our artists. Every time they're on, we compare them to Marvel superheroes when they give us their origin story. So Joe, we're going to start right off with you growing up here right on Long Island in Seaford. If you could give us just a background to start about your origin story, and when coming up on Long Island does art start to take hold and become such an important part for you?
So I'll preface this by saying I have an identical twin brother who teaches at Seaford High School. He teaches history and psychology, and I bring that up because growing up, both of us were good at art. And we both drew, and when we were first younger, we were drawing football players and baseball players. We both, in elementary school, were put into advanced art classes. So I think in 4th grade, I was put in an advanced art class, and so was he. I mean, this is a long time ago. The advanced art classes weren't what they are now.
Right.
And then throughout junior high and high school, we both sort of would alternate winning, like, best artist or whatever, they have, or most artistic or something. So the point is about having a twin brother, though, it never seemed special because he was good at it too, and we were both doing it. Right. But probably, I guess the earliest thing would be, looking back, would be probably in those elementary schools, being put in those advanced classes. And it really wasn't until high school, when you have to start thinking about college, where what do you want to do? It's not like I thought I wanted to be an artist when I was younger. I didn't really have any idea what that meant.
Right.
And so once I figured, I remember thinking in high school, well, there's a million jobs out there or careers you can go down. I know I'm good in art, so if I can kind of at least narrow it down to that, that's like makes it down to maybe like 1,000 jobs. And so I ended up applying to School of Visual Arts and went to School of Visual Arts for I got my BFA there, and started off in illustration because my parents thought at the time I wanted go into commercial art. And a good friend of mine who I grew up with also went to SVA, so we took the train in together and did our first year together that way. And he was also in illustration. And then my first year of college, I just fell in love with painting. So my second year, I decided to switch over to fine arts. Nice. And then kind of didn't look back from then on.
Yeah, and kind of so tell Joe, our students for the most part, they use what we give them to really make these decisions early on. And MK and I in our whole department kind of pride ourselves on the fact that we've been doing it so long that we feel very comfortable with steering kids to certain programs. So, just let us know and let our kids know, what was that experience at SVA? Because you went to an all art college, which is much different than, say, going to a large university and an art program within that university. So for you, did you feel like it was more competitive per se than one of the local schools? How did you feel like you fit into that program?
So you make a good point, and I've worked at universities as well, where they've had art programs within the universities. And depending, I guess, on the university, it depends on the program that they have. I would say I think I'm actually a pretty strong believer that if you want to go for art, that you need to go to an art school. And in the New York area, that was either SVA, Parsons, Pratt was sort of the big one.
Yep.
Otherwise up in the Northeast, there's, RISD and Maryland Institute, our Chicago Institute, and then Ringling College of Art and Design, where I currently am department head of fine arts at. It depends on, and specifically what you want to go for. And so all those different schools have different strengths. Right. But I do believe, knowing many other people who went into the arts via other universities or sort of smaller programs, they just really didn't, I think, get the most out of it.
Right, right. And we say that a lot. We tell the kids that, for the most part, it's really about what you put into the experience also. If you take advantage of everything they have to offer. And that's why we have a lot of kids who come to us and right off the bat say something like, well, I want to be an art teacher, or I want to do that. And they're very specific. And so usually when I'm dealing with the senior portfolio kids, my first advice is get your BFA in fine art studio practice first. You can always be a quote unquote, whatever else it is after. Be an artist first and a blank second, a teacher second, or a curator second, or an advertising executive second. Like, I feel like when I went to school, I did it in the reverse. I went for art education, so I got a bachelor's of science. And I felt like because of that, I missed out on a lot of studio time. You get a lot of methodology classes, a lot of education and child psych classes. So how do you feel about that in terms of pursuing a career in the arts? Is it more important to get that BFA first, do you feel?
Well, so I probably would say yes, but it also depends on the student. So I know at SVA when I was there, they had art ed and art therapy as I think they were minors or I guess specific programs, and they threw you right into the classrooms right away because it's not what you. In often cases, it's probably not what you think it is, and so they did that just to make sure this is what you want to do. But I do think it's important to probably get your degree first, because in studio art or whatever you want to get, because then you can always get your teaching degree afterwards. And if you go into teaching, especially in high school, you're going to need that extra degree anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we tell them too. But it's also important, I think, that, with MK and I both being practicing artists with studio practices outside of the daily teaching schedule, I think it's important, and for lack of a better term, it gives you better street cred with the students when you practice what you preach. I mean, if you're an actual artist and you're a teaching artist, I think that makes a heck of a lot of a difference for the respect level that you get, whereas you get, we know so many very talented art educators who don't see themselves as artists first.
Yeah, they're teachers first.
They're teachers first. And
plus the people that you surround yourself with in the fine art program, especially of an art college, it's a different group of people.
Right.
It totally is. And you're also generally at art colleges, especially the ones I mentioned, you're working with professionals in the industry.
Exactly.
As well. And they're often teachers, but they're not necessarily art teachers or professors as they would at certain universities, which may have sort of teacher first and artist second. And I thought, especially at SVA, that was really important experience for me, is that you're working from these people who are professionals in the field. And then you, it makes it more reasonable that you kind of achieve this on your own if you're working with other people that have done it.
Because you're surrounded by it,
Yeah. I think it really enriches the experience too. It just puts you in a certain mindset. It's interesting because MK and I were talking about it at work today during one of our shared off periods, and I said to MK, I said, I really feel like after talking to Joe during the pre-check earlier in the week, he is what I consider a throwback in terms of artists, like nowadays, because nowadays, and especially with all the guests that we've talked to previously, a lot of it is heavy social media. It's all about promoting and self-promoting and website designs and getting your work out there and going through your dossier of professional experience and looking at your website and looking at your history and your CV. You really are an old school. You're a gallery guy. You're represented by that. You're always looking to get exhibitions up. You're publishing books. Tell me how.
Do you agree with that, Joe?
Yeah, would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's I would, and it's funny because it really is a generational change. And today I was doing crits with some juniors and seniors and sophomores, and it's just a whole other. That's a whole other generation. And I'm still probably a few years older than you guys. I'm sure that's probably a generation as well. When I was a student at SVA, the idea of even getting a master's degree wasn't even considered because everyone who taught there were professional artists. Didn't have master's degrees necessarily. It wasn't necessarily the step that you needed. So it took me 10 years before I went back and got my master's degree. And at the time I remember graduating thinking that if I make a career, if I could support myself by the time I'm 40, then I'll be successful. So it wasn't, and that changed in the early 2000s when the art market boomed and people were getting plucked right out of grad schools.
Right.
So the whole art market has changed significantly since when I was when I got out. And then when I got out of School of Visual Arts, I graduated. I ended up moving to upstate New York to Woodstock and lived up there for a couple of years. I was working for this woman who I met in the city, and then she moved her business upstate and worked with her. And Woodstock is an old arts community from the 1902. And so I kind of looked at that as my grad school in a way, because it's a very creative community, kind of the equivalent of the Hamptons, but upstate, and a lot of artists, a lot of history up there. And that kind of got me going. And then eventually from there, I moved back down to New York City, because even though I was doing well up in Woodstock, I was in the newspapers, I was on the local TV, I was selling work. I was on their artist association. I was like the youngest member on their artist association. And I just say this because I got, I made them, I worked really hard and made the most of it and got involved in the community. But you can only go so far up there. And so that's when I moved back down to New York City and gave it a go up there. Coincidentally, a couple of big things I thought were helpful. First, I'll just quickly go back. And when I was a student at School of Visual Arts, I had 2 jobs working for artists. And that was really beneficial because one was a painter that I worked for about a year and a half, and the other was a sculptor. And in a way, those, I guess, would be equivalent of internships, today. But you really get to see how they live and how they work. And especially the painter I worked for, he was even a throwback to someone from the 50s. That was in an old loft down on the Lower East Side, and he would listen to jazz, and it was a throwback time. You had no idea what year it was. And that I think is part of where my work eventually, my love of the work that I eventually did came from. The other thing I was going to say was when I moved back to New York through a high school friend from Seabird High School who was working at SVA. She was quitting her job, recommended I get the job, and I ended up working at SVA for 10 years. Wow. And that was really helpful because I was still in my early 20s or mid 20s at that point, and still trying to understand how to. I was making work and kind of showing in little local, kind of smaller galleries here and there, but not like nothing with a big name or anything that would get really a review. But enough to kind of encourage it, and I saw work here and there. And working at SVA was really beneficial in that I got to meet a lot of people. And see artists, and especially see artists who I thought were really successful because they'd be coming and teaching, and then realizing in some cases that they really needed that job. And so even though and then it was a question of, well, what is success? So they had critical acclaim, but then they didn't have this financial stability. And so kind of just looking at things like that. But through that, eventually I got my MFA at SVA. Which they paid for. So I didn't have, so I was able to keep my full-time job and keep my full-time salary. Plus they paid for my master's degree. And that was really beneficial because I went into that program. My work was changing at that point, and that was when I just started to make the miniature sculptures. It afforded me the freedom to not to go into school without debt and just kind of make work and kind of see what happens.
Gave you a little bit of freedom.
It gave me a lot of freedom. And then the initial benefit from that was that connections I had, or artists or faculty I knew from working there, and programs that I ran ended up helping me out while I was a MFA student. Mostly, I think because of the work I was making, but those connections definitely helped.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a huge point. And that's a throwback attitude about making those connections and putting yourself in the environment and becoming part of that environment. And, MK and I were talking about that a little bit today too. It's like when you immerse yourself in that world, you become an integral part of that by association. And then you just kind of, you know, it's very similar to when I think about like the tattoo industry. So many tattoo artists that I'm friends with started off just hanging out in the shop with no background whatsoever. And, you know, eventually they meet somebody and they show them their work, and somebody says, oh, let me take you on. I'll you know, have your apprenticeship, and then you'll work for me. And it sounds very, very similar. Like it's all interconnected like that. Working with, you know, like you said, almost like an intern or apprenticeship under a master artist, and then learning the environment and the behaviors and the lifestyle. Just
diving headfirst into anything that you do, you know, for our kids is an important thing.
Oh, a lot of hard work, dedication, and the most important thing I would say is perseverance. And I've interviewed, again, a lot of artists, and they often say that, and I've seen it, you know, the older I've gotten, a number of friends, and to no fault of their own, who just either didn't get the right break or were doing other things. Eventually they just kind of gave up making art, and then they just stopped. But if you keep it up, you know, and obviously have some talent and a little bit of luck, I do believe that you'll succeed. And you have to think more in the long term. I think the challenge with, especially with looking what happened in the early 2000s, and even now, is that artists were coming right out of grad schools and having this really quick success, like they deserved it.
Like they didn't pay their dues, type of thing.
And then I know that's also challenging for them too, because they've had getting success early also is not helpful.
It's almost like a false hope. You know, it kind of gives you that you know, that sense of stability that's not really always there, especially in the fine art world. You know, there's nothing that's guaranteed, and we tell the kids that all the time. It's like you said, there's no overnight success. It's always how much hustle and hard work and elbow grease you put into it. And like you said, the perseverance is key. And I think that that's just a major part that, especially now, and I hate sounding like we're generational, but the groups of kids that we have, you know, with TikTok and YouTube and all these quote unquote instant celebrities and influencers, everybody wants to be an influencer or, you know, have 1 million followers on YouTube. And they think that qualifies as making it. And then next thing you know, and in 3 years, that person's never heard from again. Where's the stability? Where's the long-term commitment to doing something? And I think it's interesting that you brought up that, you know, people who kind of burnt out early on and flamed out, where I kind of compare it to, you know, owning a car. When you pay for that car, you have a greater admiration for what it took to keep that car going. Whereas opposed to like when I had friends growing up whose parents gave them cars, when they graduated, they beat the crap out of them and used them up, and, you know, they thought they were going to get another one, and they never did. And then reality hit, you had to go work and buy another car. You know, it's the same kind of philosophy, I think. And that's what you're alluding to, is that, you know, if you don't put that work in, you're not going to respect it.
Well, I think what I've learned from all my interviews with artists is that the successful artists are successful the same reason anyone in any other endeavor that is any other successful person in any other field is successful, because they work their butts off. You know, and then just a little bit of luck and community, and generally they got a lot of just like people get jobs, recommendations from friends.
Right.
Do you feel, Joe, that, like you talked before about somebody, like people getting big breaks, do you feel like that job at SVA was your big break, or your break, or that little bit of luck that you needed?
That was one of them. I mean, at the time, I ended up working there for 10 years. And so it took 10 years before that really became my break. Right. But looking back, that that time working there was really helpful. It gave me experience. It gave me good friendships, and introduced me to some people who are still my dearest friends, who are older, older art historians and who were teachers. And then also gave me the opportunity to get my master's degree. But the biggest one was, and I won't necessarily name drop, but when I was I was in grad school, and a critic recommended me for a show at PS1 along with 2 other artists. And so like on a Thursday, and by Saturday I dropped my work off. And that show got reviewed in the Brooklyn Rail, and I sold my first sculpture there, and that got a lot of attention. So that was directly through a connection of this person who I had hired when I was running a residency program at SVA as a critic. Not that was the reason, but he believed in the work. You know, and still even to this day, I'm familiar, you know, friendly with that person, and he's just supported my current show. So
yeah, that's great.
It helps.
It's so important. I think that the great message for our kids throughout this whole part of this conversation is you've obviously allowed for whatever environment you were in to inform you in one way, shape, or form towards what you wanted to do next. And I think that that's, you know, it's not always easy to do that. It's almost thinking like a chess player 3 moves ahead. Like you almost have to be like, well, I want to put myself here because in 5 years I see myself doing this. So if I can place myself in the right areas now and talk to the right people now and make connections with the right people now, then maybe it'll get me to where I envision myself in 5 years. Is that kind of how your mentality was?
Totally, and I, you know, again, it depends on the type of the field of art you're going into. So especially with fine arts, and again, as I said earlier, I didn't expect to make a living until I was 40. So how do you? And so I just knew until then I just needed to put the work in, keep making paintings or sculptures, what I was making at the time, and just kind of persevere. I do remember one job I had at SVA, or one job under my umbrella of. I had about 3 different things that I did there. Was at one point I worked for the International Students Program, and we would travel to Asia to go to high schools there and recruit students. So we'd go to high schools and look at portfolios. And so I was traveling with this artist named Bing Lee, who's a really good artist. And we were in Hong Kong and went out to dinner, and he was probably my age now, and I was in my 20s. And we went out to dinner with some art dealers, people who write for Artforum, people who own galleries, and it was probably about a dozen or so of us. And I remember, you know, I was just a kid kind of looking back and looking at these older people who are very classy, and they're at the tops of their fields, and just thought, you know, I'm just like them, except 20 years younger. And if you just stick with it, all your friends are going to be, you know, your friends who are writers who are doing, you know, this and that. At some point, they're going to be the editors of magazines. They're going to be the directors and curators of museums. They're going to be the ones who are owning galleries. And now I'm actually at that point, and literally, I've just talked about this recently. That's actually, I mean, that's literally the case.
Yeah.
So you were networking basically early on.
Long-term networking, yeah. The other thing I find interesting with I'm just have a picture of a group of friends of mine from grad school is you also get to, I mean, and a lot of people have said this, the art world is it's actually a small world, and it is a fraternity or a sorority. And it's fairly a tight-knit community. And kind of if you stick with it, you get to a certain age, and I see this now with artists either my age or older, where you feel, not that you've gone into battle together and you've like survived the war,
right?
You've gotten over the hump where you no longer have to think like, am I an artist or not? It's just kind of
right.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's, you know, we see that kind of at the level that we teach at in high school, where they kind of all feel like by senior year, when they all come up together and they get to that portfolio class that senior year, and they all feel like they've earned their stripes, so to say.
To be in that class, yeah.
Right, to be in that class, like, because the portfolio class is designed as a strictly pass-fail class, so that there's no pressure about performing for a quote-unquote grade. You're creating work for yourself at that point. And it's kind of like the carrot at the end of the stick. Like, you've gone through our program those first 3 years, and you did everything we asked of you, and everything was rigid, and everything was academic, and now you've earned that right as a group all together to kind of do the work you really want to do now and show us everything that you've got. And that's really, I mean, it sounds very, very similar to that. It's also, it's very interesting that it harkens back to, I remember being a teacher very early on. This is my 24th year. And I remember being like in year 2 or 3, and I was really struggling at the time with connecting to the administration in the building. The administration was really not as supportive of the arts. They really didn't understand it. And I remember going to my father, who at the time he's an assistant principal in a high school. And I remember saying, Dad, I don't think I'm going to be able to do this. And I remember him saying, you're going to outlive them all. Just stick with it. Yeah. And it kind of reminded me of that by you saying, if you stick with it, all the older people are going to phase out and your crew is going to be that older group eventually.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just, that's a great thing. If our kids can have that foresight to think that way, then when they do reach those obstacles and those hurdles, they know that as long as they can get over, around, or through it, they can keep going. And there will be light at that end, and that they will see success at the end. And, I'm looking now that we have alumni in listening right now who, I hear from on a regular basis who are struggling at times and want to make something of themselves. And you got to keep telling them, listen, you have the talent. You've always had the talent. You need that resilience. You need that, like you said, that perseverance, and surround yourself with people who believe the same way, that you're all going to make it. It makes it a lot easier to get through it together than by yourself.
So, and I don't know if they're all necessarily want to be artists, or at least are making work, but if you are, I would say wherever you are, like join your local art guild, join your local community, and just start showing. I mean, so when I said earlier, I moved up to Woodstock. I started bringing my work and showing it in the diners and in the bars, wherever they would put it. Not that I was expecting necessarily to sell it, but just to get the work out there. And that was really helpful. And then joining the local artists association, because you want to have your work seen. But then you're just going to be around other like-minded people.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's a very boots on the ground mentality. It's very, you have to put the effort in and get your stuff. You're not just going to sit in your basement and have a benefactor discover you. That's never going to happen.
Any exposure is good exposure as far as getting your work out there, Yeah.
Right. Well, and just for the fun part, I mean, the fun part of the arts is the social aspect, because you do spend a lot of time, with by yourself, making the work, and so when you could either get the work out there or go to an opening or a reception, you should be out there celebrating. You shouldn't have jealousies. You should be out there celebrating your friends.
Yeah, love that.
It really becomes a built-in support group, because and we talked about it at the beginning before the program started. It's the same mentality for teachers, and Joe, being a teacher at the college level, understands that also. Like, there are certain things that you share, experiences that other people don't in that field. And I think that being an artist, that falls in that category too, where you've experienced rejection. You've experienced a letter that comes in that says, we don't think your work is good enough. And you start to question your self-worth and your talent. And then when you find somebody who's like, I got that same letter from that same gallery. All of a sudden,
it's your support system.
Right. That blow doesn't hit you as hard when you realize that somebody else has gone through that same exact experience and they're still plugging along.
And you make a really good point, and I would even continue to say that you really have to have a thick skin. And the thing I think with what's been beneficial with art is you're constantly being critiqued, right? You're critiquing yourself. You're being critiqued by your teachers, and then eventually you're self-critiquing, which I think is really important, because you're looking at yourself and analyzing your work, or just things that you're doing. And I know my wife, for example, does not have that, and she has a hard time with criticism. But you can't take it. You can't take it personally. It's really a way to learn how to grow. So I think you definitely need to have a thick skin is part of it as well.
Thick skin and an open mind.
And an open mind. Yep.
To really listen to that constructive criticism, and not have your ego can't be too big.
Right, and a willingness to take risks, because you really have to put yourself out there. Yes. If you don't have the guts to say, this is my stuff, this is what I do, take it or leave it. You really have to have that urge to take that first jump and see where it takes you. And if some people are going to resonate with it and some people aren't. Which brings me to MK. I know we have images of Joe's stuff.
Yeah, I got a lot.
Go ahead.
I just want to just add one more thing, because I thought this was important, was just kind of with being critiqued, and also kind of having that self-doubt that you talked about, which is true. And every artist that I know has that self-doubt, and you'll have some days where you're in the studio and just things aren't going well, and you're like, I am the worst artist ever. I wasted 30 years of my life. But then the next day you'll kind of kick it in, and you're like, I'm just the greatest artist ever. But the thing is, it doesn't change. And I was talking with Eric Fischel, who's for me one of my huge idols, who's now in the 70s, and he kind of works in series. And you start a new body of work, and you don't know if it's gonna succeed or what to make of it. You have to just kind of trust yourself and follow. Right. And he has the same exact doubts that I have and everyone else, even though he's
Eric Fischel. Right. Yeah. Well, I think what plays into that too is, especially the more established you get, the more difficult it is to take chances, because once you have this quote unquote, this body of work and this signature style,
you become known as that guy.
Yes, you become known as that artist, and it's almost very difficult, especially when you have, as most artists do, have a fragile ego about their stuff to begin with.
It's like a band that has that hit song, and the fans like, oh, they like your new stuff, but I want to hear the old stuff.
Right. It's like asking Mick Jagger at 75 to play a song from 1973, and he's like, really? Can we move on from that? Like, it's almost like, I think even for Eric Fischel, like, he's nervous about losing the cred of being Eric Fischel if he tries something different. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I just had this painting right here, so you can see it. So I had done a whole series of about 40 of these paintings, which were paintings based on films about artists.
Yep.
So that's Raphael. So this is from Agony and the Ecstasy, which was a film about Michelangelo. Yes. And so in that, so with all these films about artists, I was looking for those other artists that were in the films for just literally 2-3 minutes. So that's Raphael, young Raphael, working on this mural in one of the side chapels. And then that's Raphael. I mean, it's, Raphael. And then that's Pope Benedict critiquing him.
Oh, really?
In the background, yeah. And so I'm like, even Raphael gets like,
yes. Of course, absolutely. Yeah. It's a tale as old as time. I mean, it's just, once you put your work out in the public view, you become a target for people's opinions, whether you want to hear it or not.
Yeah.
But MK, let's start pulling up, because Joe's stuff.
Sure.
I mean, starting with I remember being at the Nassau County Museum, like we said, and I saw that poster, and I said to myself, this is an artist that I can completely get, because of his love of the historical context of where art is and the interaction between the viewer and the artwork. And I think Joe's narrative as an artist, watching other people look at art, is brilliant, because it shows not only an understanding of what it's like to immerse yourself in somebody's artwork, but to just make it about the whole scene, that whole world. Joe, tell us, how did this whole series of your interest in other artists' workspaces and techniques, where did that start and where did that come from?
So they're probably so that initially started with and I didn't realize this until afterwards, with when I had that job working for that painter down on the Lower East Side. I just like the smell of the oil paints. I was using stretching canvas using rabbit skin glue, which is like an old technique from the 1500s. So, and that was like, you have to heat that on a hot plate, then it would kind of get liquid and have this really nice smell to it, and kind of slop it on. And so then years later, when I was back in, just before I started grad school, I've been making paintings of people in everyday scenes, and I did that for about 10 years. And then I started thinking, and I literally came to an end with that, and so I felt I had to start over again. So I'm trying to just do everything opposite, trying to just grab onto something to just keep working and see what the next thing is going to be. And so then I started making, and I won't go through the whole process, but eventually I made a miniature figure of an artist in a snow globe, and thought that was too restrictive. So I took the artist out of the snow globe, and then started making basically these dollhouse scale sculptures of artists in the studios. And first I started off with historical artists, going through references from books mostly, and there weren't really many photos of that. And my prior 10 years of paintings we're all through my firsthand experience, and we're all from my perspective. And so me being in that space with these people and in an environment was really critical to the work. And the historical sculptures I was making, it was sort of missing that until I went out to Long Island, out to Jackson Pollock's studio in the Springs. And actually it's October now, a beautiful October day. It was just me and my wife at the time, and no one else was there. And to be in the studio and walk in it, first off, it's much smaller than you think, but it makes it more palpable. And so that was the first historical sculpture I made of an artist, but since I was at the space, I knew what the space was. And so then I referenced old photographs that were taken, and I was able to rebuild the studio. And then at that point, then I realized that I needed to go to visit artists firsthand, there you go, and get that experience. And then the aha moment from there, and I actually happen to have this photo here. It's a little dusty, but
oh yeah, look at that.
So that is let's see, there he is. That was a teacher of mine at SVA when I was an undergrad named Michael Goldberg. So he was a second generation abstract expressionist. He knew de Kooning and Pollock and all those guys. And his studio is down on the Bowery, and his studio used to belong to Mark Rothko. And so I'd gone to his studio to make a sculpture of his painting table, which is kind of like right there. And he was just telling these amazing stories, showing me the crimson stains on the floor where Rothko had painted the Four Seasons paintings. And then the photo I took was on a balcony level where you could look down on it used to be an old basketball court. It was like looking down on a stage, like a theater. And so when I left there, I literally thought like, oh shit, I wish I would have recorded that somehow, because it was just such an amazing experience. And so I literally went home, came up with a list of questions, and then just started reaching out to all, I guess, faculty or who I knew from SVA. And then eventually they would recommend other artists. And that's eventually where the first book came about, was through my own process. I had all these byproducts, which were the interviews, the documentary photographs, and then the sculptures themselves. But the key, I think, for the sculptures, even though some of the historical figures are good sculptures, especially Pollock, I think there you go, that's Michael Goldberg's table. That led me to getting back into that firsthand experience, and that completely freed me up. And that then I could depict, if I'm going to depict a artist studio, I could choose the angle or how much or how little I want to get.
I mean, awesome. It's so, and MK and I were talking about this the other day too. Like, we are so intrigued by artists' process and their technique and their environment, how the environment informs them. And it almost feels like MK, like, you know how my mind works. I know how your mind works. I feel like Joe is like our spirit animal. Like, the things that he wants to portray, he shares the same passion for the history. Like, I can just see, like, when you read about an artist and you research them and study them, and then, like, I remember my first time walking into the Springs barn and saying, holy shit, like, this is where he made everything that I've studied in my life. He's touched this. Like, there's a reverence to everythve Is that how it kind of clicked? Is that what started it for you? Was that feeling of reverence?
And probably not when I've thought of it earlier. When I graduated undergraduate school, that summer my brother and I drove cross country for 6 weeks, and in Kansas City, we stopped at Thomas Hart Benton's studio as a national park, where it's it's basically left as it was the day he died. And that was really the first time that I was in a historical studio. And yeah, you got that feeling like, oh, this is where he worked, and I was a big fan of his work. This is where he worked, and these are his paints, and these are his brushes, and so forth. And that was really important. And then years later, when I started interviewing artists, one of the fun things was one of the artists, my very first interview, we were talking about something, and he said, excuse me. So he goes over to a flat file and pulls out like a house painter's brush, and he's like, this was Barnett Newman's. And I'm like, that is so cool. Oh, there's Thomas
And
Garcia. Look at it.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it goes back to that fraternity sorority kind of mindset. Like everybody is in awe of everybody else's stuff. And you look at somebody like, I'm sure Eric Fischel, who you look up to, has an artist that he looks up to. And then when you find out who it is, you're like, really? Like that's who they admire? Like it's fascinating, and it becomes like this rabbit hole that you keep going down. It's like connecting almost
one
like
thing
6
feeds
degrees
to the next. Yeah.
Right. It's like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Like MK and I love like the social media aspect of Instagram. Like our big thing is to see what artists are following other artists on Instagram. Like, we follow so-and-so, and then we look at their following like, oh my God, they also follow ABCDE. Like we follow ABCDE. It's just so mind-boggling that you were doing that pre-social media, right? Like that's really
it goes back so long ago. When I first started reaching out to artists, I had to write them letters.
Yeah. That's exact. I mean, that's amazing.
And Xeroxes of some of the work and say, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah, and it's funny is that I feel that connection with Joe because that's what we do with this program, MK.
It's exactly that, yeah.
It started off with, for those of you who may not be familiar, like with the Portfolio Group 5 years ago, I started a Skype interview program where I just cold called and emailed artists that I admired and said, listen, I have this program. I would love to give my students a real world experience and connect with an artist to see what your studio space is like, to learn about things like how to file your taxes, how to make a living, how to do, and it just snowballed. And did you find that, like I find now with this, it becomes almost like a badge of honor, not to brag about what we're doing, but you start to name drop, well, I interviewed this one, and this one, and then suddenly it's like, well, I need to be on that too. Were you getting that?
Definitely. The more sort of big names or just people that you get, or then I just actually ask them for recommendations. Then it's easier to say, so Eric Fischel recommended I talk to you, or so and so recommended I talk to you. So that introduction helps for sure.
Yeah.
You guys remind me a little bit of Judd Apatow.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
When he was I guess actually I was going to say only because you're at the high school, but when he was a high school student, he would he just had a book published because he still has all these recordings. He worked at his high school radio station and would just cold call all these comedians that were coming out to play on Long Island and interview them.
That's awesome. Yeah.
On the radio station, and they had no clue. He was like a
up and coming
kid.
Yeah.
MK, what were we gonna say? I was
gonna say, like, when you were sending out those letters, so was there any artist that you got in contact with that agreed to do the interview that wasn't necessarily part of your inner circle that you were like, wow, I'm like anybody that had a wow factor, you're like, this is like,
oh, like I would say all of them. Like
all of them.
So even looking at the first book, some of them I had known from school. Eric Fischel was a big one. Chuck Close was huge.
I mean, he's got a greatest hits in that book. You look at that book.
Yeah.
And
there's a bunch of MacArthur Genius winners, Malcolm Morley, even Philip Pearlstein, who's still alive, who's in his late 90s. Dana Schutz was in this, Mary Heilman. Fred Tomaselli was a big one that I was really nervous to meet. And then some of them were more younger, closer to my age. I really tried to get sort of a range of people. And then in the second book, again, some of these people I knew at this point, but then some of the bigger artists like Judy Pfaff, Roxy Payne, I was a big fan of his work. Philip Taft was a pretty guy. Actually, one of my favorites, I was a huge fan of his forever, and didn't really meet him until later, was Red Grooms.
Really? I was just about to ask you, was there one that stood out as what's your most memorable interview?
I think for a long time, it was probably meeting Eric Fischel and April Gornick. And because first off, I went out to their studio, and their studio is out in Sag Harbor, and it's just one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen. And he was also, when I was younger, a student, there weren't many people doing figurative painting at the time. So this would have been in the late 80s. So Eric Fischel was one of them. Red Grooms was another influence, and then maybe David Hockney, but he wasn't American. And so I first got out to do something small for them, and their studios were so amazing that I wrote them back and asked if I could actually make a sculpture of their dual studios, which is ended up being the biggest sculpture I made, and took the longest. It took about 8 months. And the great part was Eric had built it, so he had the blueprints. So he just gave me the blueprints.
Oh wow,
that's awesome.
To work from.
It's really like he has a library of resources for studio spaces. Like it's my admiration, Joe, for what you've accomplished with this collection. There we go. That's
the interior.
Right.
Yeah. So it's the fun part. So I built everything, and then that's another view of the interior.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's the outside of the sculpture. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's 8 foot across. It's two 4-foot sections of wood.
Wow.
So then there's April's on the left, and then Eric's over on the right. And I do want to say, and you brought this up, you started to allude to this earlier, and I have found that it's really true with people who come on even on your program. Artists really are the most generous.
Absolutely.
The most generous people I've met. Hardest working, and really the most generous and most supportive. And especially when our older artists, and a number have literally said this, they feel they have an obligation, or basically once you kind of hit a certain level, to help people
pay it forward
and pay it forward, because you were in that same position as well. And I've often found even these artists who you would think would have huge egos because of how we perceive who they are.
Yeah.
They're just not. They're just very, very generous and humble.
We've definitely learned that, because we've gone into many of these completely fanboying and like absolutely.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it too is because artists are so, it can come across as being a negative. No, but like most artists are egotistical. So your ego is based on your legacy. You want to leave a positive legacy. You don't want to be the artist that everybody said, oh, that guy was a prick. Like he didn't want to talk to anybody. That's the big thing, is you want to be well liked too. You want to be respected. You want to be admired for what you've done in your entire career. You're au viewer, right?
Well liked is a little chart, but I would say you want to be respected. But the big thing, and I tell people this all the time, young artists, and I was thinking of this, don't be an asshole.
Right.
We said that last week with our last guest.
Don't be an asshole, because you know what? Even no matter what field you're in, because if you're in the arts, say in this case an artist, but I've seen this. I feel like I've seen this even with Hollywood actors like Colin Farrell, who I've heard was a real asshole and like an arrogant, like, younger. There's lots of other artists out there. There's lots of other actors. Like if you're challenging and difficult, there's no longer this sort of like genius artist that we'll work with you no matter what. They're gonna say, forget it. We'll just go with the next guy.
The next person.
Right.
You're a pain in the ass to work with.
Yeah.
You can't be Pollock and pissing Betty Parsons' fireplace anymore.
Not anymore. You can't, because you're working with, even if you're working with a gallery. First, the gallerist I worked with, we were friends before she opened her gallery. You're literally in 50-50 partners with them. So it's a business partner and a business deal. Or if you're working with curators or directors, if you have a museum show or something, you're that goes a long way if you're nice, and work hard and you come prepared.
Right, you become the face of that gallery and their representation out in the world. That gallery is hedging its bets that it's going to bring business in through you.
They're representing you, but you're also representing them.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So now that leads me to ask you. Go ahead.
Well, I just will say also, as an artist, because you just mentioned it is maybe, and this is kind of maybe will sound old school, but that your name is your, or like your word is your reputation. Right. That's it. And so it comes with either anything you put out in the world as far as artwork has to be strong, or it should be at least to your best. If it's not, or how it's judged once it's out there, that's not necessarily up to you, but you have to give your all into everything. And especially I think in the arts, you're often a small business owner. So aside from without getting into taxes, but with catalogs that are coming out, with other if you're doing a show with any press, I'm on top of all of that just to kind of have my fingers in it, because I want to. It all represents you.
Yeah.
Right.
Your corporate identity. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah. You
Yeah.
know, sort of your brand, I guess.
Your brand. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's gonna, that let me ask you this, Joe. That leads segues right into the next question, which is, being that we feel like you are like this old school throwback type of artist, and we know you have a fantastic show up right now. You're represented with Cristin Tierney here in New York City. How important is that nowadays in this time? How important is that gallery relationship? In terms of everything that we see coming out, like you can make your own website now, you can sell work on your own. Why is that gallery representation in that show still so important?
So that's a good question, and things may change. It's
Right.
it's really hard to say where we're at and what's going to happen. But I do feel it was well. I feel grateful. Well, I knew I was having the show, but grateful that the show got reviewed in the New Yorker, and then also just got reviewed in White Hot Magazine, which actually gave an in-depth, sort of the first in-depth consideration of the new work, which was just exciting for me as an artist, because the work is still relatively new, and to get that feedback and it was considered and that people take it seriously is still amazing. So that does go a long way. It actually does go a long way, because even though that it's still the established way of the art market, it's still New York. And growing up in Long Island and living in New York, I still believe New York is the capital of the art world. So to get that acknowledgement in New York really means a lot.
Right.
Really means a lot to me.
Yeah. I mean, but do you feel like at this, that's the show. I mean, the show is gorgeous.
But you can't control that stuff. You don't know how that's going to happen.
Right.
But I will say, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, when I got my first New York Times review, obviously it was exciting. And then eventually I had 7 New York Times reviews for either solo shows or group shows. And I've been in lucky enough to be in the other magazines. It's funny where, I mean, generally kind of the excitement lasts for about, if it's a day at the most, that's long. Maybe it's like a couple hours. Then you go back and read it, because it's almost kind of, in some way, then it's kind of just expected, because you're playing in the big leagues. So like you're a musician, your album comes out, right? Like you expect to get some sort of press and some sort of notice, and so you kind of don't think it's going to happen, but then you kind of hope you then kind of think it's going to happen, because you expect that, but you never know, and you can't control it, and so. But it is really exciting when it does, and more so that it shows that the exhibition was real and existed. So now, once the show is over in 2 weeks, the show's gone, right? Except if I make a painting of it. But the show is gone, but it will live in those reviews. And those reviews are important, because it actually those weekends a lot of people have come to see the show. And I remember my first New York Times review was a show in 2006. That weekend, a lot of people came, and then we sold out that whole show.
Wow.
Which
is fantastic.
I like that. I like where you say that, like the review is like almost like evidence that it actually happened after it's gone. And really that's what your paintings are kind of about too. Like documenting.
You're right. Yeah. Because the paintings are and look, and this has also come up in conversation. Like, we miss a lot of shows. There's a lot of museum shows I've missed. There's been articles on like the show you wish you went to see, because you can't see everything. And so and really, especially the gallery shows are not up for a very long time. Museum shows are up maybe a little bit longer. And to see some of these shows, I guess it is. I don't know. Maybe it's like seeing. I don't know. whatever, Bob Dylan in like 1967,
right?
Yeah,
or something, you know, like it's years later. It's just a different show.
yeah,
Right.
I've always actually related to exhibitions as I always thought of them more as albums,
yeah,
which also goes back to Holium, and kind of like concept albums, where you're working on a body of work that kind of comes together in one group.
yeah,
And there's an arc and a story to it, and that depends on how the show is laid out. And you could have like your 9-minute, you know, Stairway to Heaven song, and then your shorter ones. But it's kind of looking at the group of paintings or sculptures or photographs or whatever as a body of work to encapsulate an album or a show, or which would be a show. So no, that's how I lost my train of thought. But that's kind of how I look at these. And so it's and then it's gone, and then you're doing your next thing, you know.
yeah.
Right. But I think what's interesting about that whole concept of the exhibition and recording the exhibition. I think for artists, it becomes a documentation also of where you were when you saw that show. Like it brings you right to, it's like remembering Game 7 of the '86 series with the Mets. Like I know exactly where I was. I was in my cousin's basement in Brooklyn. I was like 10 years old. I got crushed between two of my older cousins because they jumped up and screamed. I remember seeing the Michelangelo blockbuster at the Met a few years ago. Like those are the kinds of things you relate to.
Totally. Look, and you know, growing up on Long Island, Seaford High School, where my brother teaches now, and we went, is much different than it was. But our art program wasn't that great, and my parents didn't know anything about art, so I had to learn this, and it took a long time being at SVA to kind of immerse yourself, to kind of learn the language and the appreciation for art. And even where I'm at Ringling College, I mean, our art department is small. I feel like it's the backbone of the college because it is an art school and you need your fine arts program. But there's a lot of other majors that just don't. They're just not part of their culture to go to museums or galleries. They're more involved in the entertainment side, which is kind of no fault of their own. And either they just don't understand it or think that they don't understand it. And there is a bit of learning a language. It's like trying to learn various types of music, right? Like you know, you can kind of get an understanding of it, but you need to immerse yourself. But one thing you were just talking about with being at galleries and shows, there are shows that I remember when I was a student back in going down to Soho at the time. Still, you know, have big memories for me of what art was and how powerful works could be, and not even necessarily paintings, but like James Turrell's light pieces, where like just blew me away.
Right.
It's kind of like you're like the courtroom artist of the art world in a way. You know, like if you think about it.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah,
it's like
he documents.
You're documenting the moment. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting. So yes, and the challenge I had when I first started making these paintings was just thinking like, oh, these are just people looking at paintings. Like people take photos of this stuff all the time, but they're really not. They're kind of they over time. I was just telling this to students, like you need to just make your work and then kind of figure out what they mean afterwards. I mean, you can kind of come in with a concept or an idea, but generally that doesn't. The best work kind of comes out of the work itself, and then you kind of figure that out. One review though in White Hot Magazine I thought was interesting. Their take was that it's also documenting recent exhibitions too, which then quickly become history, and then kind of pulling them back into now like contemporary.
Yeah.
Right. And now let me ask you, Joe, how do you decide which exhibits to portray? Is there a certain rhyme or reason? Is there a certain level of importance that you place on them? Like we were looking through, and you have some great ones, like the Amy Sherrill exhibition and the Kerry James Marshall exhibition. Are you looking for certain ones based on the time and the societal influence that they have?
So it kind of depends. So the Amy Sherrill show was a huge, and that was in a gallery. So that was a big gallery show. She had just done Michelle Obama's portrait.
Right.
And that was a really big show, got a lot of press, and so that obviously you had to just go see. And so that I felt was worth documenting. Kerry James Marshall is a really great artist, and the Met Brewer, which now just changed over to the Frick, They did some really great shows at that museum, and which is old Whitney. And I've almost been to every exhibition that was there from when the Whitney moved to the new one. And so I mean, those are just great shows at the Met Brewer. And then the new Whitney, I love the new Whitney Museum. I'm not a fan of MoMA. I think MoMA is kind of like too big and impersonal and too crowded. I don't get a feel for it. I like the smaller, well, even though the Met, all those museums I mentioned, the Met and the Guggenheim, and even the Whitney are big museums, obviously. They're not overcrowded. And so you can still have intimate experiences being there. And I think maybe from my experience being in an artist's studio, where it's not just the artist's work, and the artist's work in those cases is probably the least interesting thing for me. It's really everything around them that is exciting. The little things they have on their dresser. I'm looking at my little shelf right here, just like stuff that you pull up, which things that almost they forgot about, which is what I found most interesting, because as a portrait artist, which is really what I am, it's a way to look at portraiture instead of just looking at sort of the standard traditional portrait. So how people leave things on their desks, how people sit, how people stand, how people contemplate art, and everyone in the paintings that I'm doing are not the people that come in with their camera and just kind of take a photo and look. These are people who really love art, and I've been fortunate enough to. I mean, people like a lot more than I do, and they know a lot more than I do. I love looking at art, but I've gone to shows with one of my dear friends who's in the one painting called Monroe and Bob. Monroe is someone I met at School of Visual Arts, art historian, and my favorite things to do, I'll still meet him when I go up to New York, and we'll go see shows and galleries together, and it's just an education. It's like watching, better than PBS or something, like walking around with an encyclopedia, and it's just exciting. And so those experiences, but then just kind of using I often find myself just kind of being in museums and galleries as sort of just a nice, pleasant escape from the rest of the world. And there's, it's very, not meditative or temple-like is kind of the wrong word, but it either feels, I guess, familiar or just like comfortable. And you can kind of be like anonymous, like people don't really pay attention to you, so you can kind of like do things, and then you can just absorb, work on your own, and just kind of. And my viewing habits have changed with museums too, where when I go, it's no longer trying to see everything, and this happens with the art fairs as well. It's kind of more just kind of walking around, enjoying the space, and taking your time, and not being in a rush, and seeing what attracts you, and then just stop and then look at that. So anyways, and to get to your point with the paintings I choose, so some of them were big exhibitions, some of the gallery exhibitions. Other ones were, some were local. Other ones were just images, I think, that just struck me. A lot of them, to kind of just sort of play fun, sort of tongue-in-cheek, are portraits of artists who are then looking at the viewer. So there's the Alice Neal portrait of Andy Warhol.
That's one of MK's favorites.
Yeah, I love that one.
We pulled that one up before.
Well, I'm a huge Alice Neal fan, and so I love that one. Even the Rembrandt one. And then I started realizing, because I'm still kind of making these paintings, is that there is, and I was listening to some other artists talk about this, how you kind of impose restrictions on your work to kind of push the work. And even though this work is new to me, I guess by sort of restrict, to a certain scale, but to say an artwork and people, how many different combinations of that can I make and make an interesting composition? And I was thinking it was almost like, I should probably go back and look at him. Modigliani, did those little still lives of just jars.
Yep.
But how many configurations can you do of those? And so I kind of was thinking of these landscapes as well. And if you want, actually, if I could share my screen, I have a painting I'm just started working on.
Oh, that'd be great.
So I work with Photoshop, and I could kind of show you the process on how I do this.
Would love that.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
it's not just taking a picture and that's it. There's a lot of nuance which goes into the composition. Sometimes that's it. Sometimes it's not. So this is the composition of the painting that I'm starting to work on, and this is the early stages of it.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm small over there, if you could say, right? So
no, that's perfect.
So I started off with some washes and stuff, but for me, it's really the composition is critical. So this is at the Tampa Museum, and this is at a photography show of Diane Arbus. So this is basically the final composition that I came up with. But I'm gonna get rid of everyone here for a second.
Wow.
So first I needed sort of a clean image, and this was much wider. So eventually I kind of cropped it down to this, and I love just sort of the shape of it
and the balance.
So then, with the figure on the left, I had that was the one I chose, but then I also had that one, and I also had this one.
That's great.
So depending on how they are, and they're all different Photoshop. So
right
now, this is somebody looking at the work.
This is someone looking at the work, and this is actually, so this photograph I didn't touch at all. This is actually all of these. This is where she was. So she was part of that. So I could have just gotten rid of, let's say, this one. Nope. And so that was basically that was true to life. And then these other two, I think this one I ended up flipping because she was also reading the text, but I wanted her angled facing this way. And I liked how her hand, if you look up close, is kind of just touching her face very little.
Yes. Yeah.
And kind of the angle of her. So eventually I got rid of, so that kind of chose that one. Let's see if I can get rid of these now. And then the other two figures, I was following them around. They were a couple. Oh, that's cropped because it's because I cut that. Hold on.
Yeah.
So I had stances of them this way and this way. Oops. And that way. But if you see how there are sixes backwards, that's because
flipped it.
They were really that way.
Right.
But if they're this way, I kind of wanted them the other angle to kind of fit, to kind of make a better composition. And then I was torn between this image and, so then I had these two images of them, right? And I love this with the arms and the hands. And this didn't quite work. So then I made this image where I actually took her and cut her into his body on this side. But eventually I realized I didn't necessarily like those. So I took him, flipped him. And then it was a matter of, is he over here? Where does his head bisect this? How much or outline of her body do you see? What if I move her over here? What if I move her? Eventually I moved over here so that her back just kind of hugs this edge right here. And then you still get this negative space. For me, it's all about the negative space. And then you can still see his shirt and his arm kind of against that white. And then with her, I moved her over, I think to, just about here. So that I get that little bit of space right in there. And that her elbow kind of cuts into the frame, and then you kind of still get like a nice silhouette.
Right. If for those of you who are watching this right now, MK and I are grinning from ear to ear because this is.
You want to know why, Joe? You want to know why we're grinning? You just did my lesson for next week on reference and composition. So you just saved me about 3 hours worth of work. So thank you, Joe.
This is literally a master class for our kids watching this in how to set up a strong composition.
I'll show you one more.
There we go.
This is the Amy Sherrill show. So I start off, first off by blowing these up a little bit bigger. And then kind of populating the people in them. And so some of the compositions have a lot of people, some have less. And then it's kind of just a mix of does this work better? Does that work better? This guy with the cape. So he's like with the cane, he looks great.
I love that. Just even the little change that you made with the size of the pieces is something that I always stress to my AP kids. Like I always say, little changes make big differences. And that was such a little change that you made just by rescaling And it does. It makes a big difference.
I rescaled it just a little bit, so this way the two the paintings could be seen better because their faces are what you've just seen. And then from here, and then like this guy here, it was like agonizing over like how much do I have this much of him in there? Do I have that much? Like how much like do you want to put in there just to kind of get? Then I'm looking at like then the space between the figures,
the negative space,
the negative space, yeah. And then even with let's see, with this woman, let's see if I could do edit transform. You know, you make her bigger. Oops.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and drop her in a different spot.
Falls down more to the foreground then.
Right.
Yeah. Love it.
It's fascinating to watch your mind work, Joe. Yeah, it really is. It's just.
So it's fun.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, really. Thank you. I mean, that's
I mean, that is so useful, not only for our classes, but when we post this for any art teacher at the high school level.
Absolutely.
See that.
Absolutely. And for our alumni who are currently in studio spaces at school, who are still struggling with creating those images and figuring out how to put everything together. I mean, we just watched a master put together 2 frames,
and just and the trial and error, like the composition, the arrangement of the visual elements on the page, and that's exactly what you're doing. You're arranging the visual elements.
And this goes back. Here's you can see my screen. So I used to do this originally with real photographs.
Wow, it's all analog cut, right?
It's all analog cut. And so for years I've done shaped canvases, and based on this one I actually never made a painting of. But if you go into, let's see if I can find something.
The Thanksgiving table?
Yep. This one I was kind of working in like a expressionistic paints series. But these are all like individual photographs that I would then kind of cut and piece together. No different now, you can just do it in Photoshop. But I love this process. I just loved so much because it's physical and I'm taping things together and you're still moving things around. And here's an earlier Thanksgiving one. And so,
I love that.
So with these cutout shapes, eventually, when I made to construct the painting, I used 2 canvases and these were literally cut out off the canvas. And these are these are about 7-foot size paintings. So the viewer would then sit and be in front of them.
Yeah,
look at that. That's
love that. Love that.
That's fantastic.
That is great.
See, MK, that's why we relate to him, because he's got that. Like I said, he's a throwback, man.
And that's probably what, Joe? Probably like 30, 40 years old, that photo?
Let's see. Those would have been probably from
late 80s?
No, those would have been from sort of the mid-90s.
Mid-90s, yeah.
Mid-90s.
Wow. Like 25 or so years ago.
Wow.
Well, then I don't know how much this will transfer either, but so then when I went to Artist Studios, remember I told you a story with the guy who pulled up Barnett Newman's paintbrush.
Right.
So when I went to Artist Studios, I just started asking them for like brushes and stuff, whatever they had. And so I have a whole wall full of that's like a mixing spoon.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And it's just years of like caked down like acrylic paint. That's from an artist. I have a bunch of those.
Wow.
On this wall, I have palettes from artists. Here's like another.
He's like an art archaeologist.
Stick from,
I said before, you're like a steward of the art world. You know what I mean? Like
you really are. It's just he really is a documentarian. Yeah. He truly is. Yeah. I think. I said, documentarian of art, the artist, the art making process, the art studio, every aspect of it. Every aspect of it is documented. And
I think that what I love about it is the respect that you show for art, the art world, and the artists. And we said it today, Tom, just the way that you name the pieces and your name, it's the artist's name usually first, and then the name, like it's incorporated into the name of the piece. And that's so respectful, you know? And the way that you go about painting their work is within your pieces shows a tremendous amount of respect. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really does. And I think that's such an important thing for our kids to understand is you could be in the middle of it and still have reverence for the whole thing. Like don't let the fact that your ego drives you more than your love for the whole experience. Like we always say, it's always more about the journey than about the destination. And Joe obviously appreciates that whole journey. Every little nuance, every aspect, every piece of the whole experience, he has this appreciation and this, like you said, this respect for.
Because
and I think
there's a long history, and you're then
right.
becoming part of that history. And
Yeah.
you have to respect that history. You have to understand it and learn it.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
Joe, I want to end.
I was just gonna say I slept through like art history like when I was in college, like it's hard, but then eventually your interests take you to where you need to go, and I can't stress enough trying to get some understanding of where art came from and that lineage that you're a part of.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and you know, it's also too with the art history too, like you found the part of art history that you enjoy, and you're also opening other people up that may not be into art history. You're opening people up to learn about art history in a completely different way, which is beautiful.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the fun part with the sculptures I was making, and then eventually, I guess, what the books kind of came out of that is that through my own work, and I would do this when I would give lectures on the book or my own work, is when I'm showing my own work, I'm showing other artists. So basically, I'm introducing them to other artists,
Right.
and I'll talk
Absolutely,
about them, explain about them, and what they do, and then even read some quotes and so forth. So yes, it's very much part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, you know what? I mean, it's so admirable. Joe, I'm gonna finish off the interview with one last question for you. Now, I think it segues just perfectly, and you are really educating people on, like Mike said, like this art history and pulling them in. So now being part of the faculty and head at Ringling, with everything that has happened in the past 9 months, where do you feel this whole education system, especially for the arts, are we headed down a different path now with all of these changes? Do you ever think we're going to get that back? How have you as a professor and as a teacher, how are you handling all of these different changes, and has it affected you in any way adversely?
So the adverse effect, I would say, would just be that we had a smaller freshman class this year. And that's, there's a lot of ways you kind of can't help that. So that would be the adverse way. The positive way, and this maybe goes back to old school, but this wasn't my decision alone. The summer, the decisions, the initial decision was that everyone would be on campus. And then they pivoted, which made sense at the time, to have all liberal arts and art history, and then some studio classes would be online. And then eventually they went to a hybrid model, and then sort of a combination, which ended up being successful because our enrollment has basically stayed the same, of online classes, hybrid, which is probably what you're doing, where you're half in class, half outside of class, or classes kind of share, one day they're in, one day they're out, and then purely online. I'm sorry, purely in person. The fine arts program decided to be in person because we're small, and so we were able, and we have a huge studio space, a building where all the studios are. So all the students got studios. We felt it was important to work in person and see the work in person to critique it. It worked out fine in the spring to see things online and do crits that way, but we were just missing it. And I reached out to all the students, and they all said they wanted to be back as well. So it was a mutual decision. So in some ways we're kind of just doing what we've been doing. And maybe that's kind of the old school part of me. I hope to think it's wasn't a decision out of laziness and hoping for the best, because it was a lot of work to go online and even to go hybrid. I mean, we were in meetings all summer, and it works for some majors. They only live on the computer, so it was a lot easier for them. For our major, access to printmaking facilities, to sculpture facilities, to the painting studios. We have our own gallery on campus, so to do exhibitions, all that stuff, we just needed to be together. So So in some ways right now it hasn't affected us that much at all, knock on wood, and hopefully we'll stay that way and the students are taking it serious. I think for the spring semester we're going to continue this, which was not the plan. So now I'm looking at if I need to make adjustments, because we did have a number of students who were sophomores who worked online because they were able to do that, how the structure of the program works. But once you're in third, fourth year, you really need to be in person.
Right. Yeah. Just
the way the classes are. I will say the one big positive I have noticed is actually doing things like this, and the Zoom, the Zoomification of education has actually in a way really helped. It's actually kept people connected.
I think MK and I agree that this whole program that we've started since quarantine has been the one light in the dumpster fire that has been 2020.
I know, yeah.
But like what you've said, like the fact that we've been able to use this technology, whereas we come from, like you, we're very tactile in our approach to making things. We will never change that. There has to be, your hands have to have oil paint on them. You have to smell like turpentine. Like you said, when you start to mix rabbit glue and that smell, like everything comes back. It's all visceral and it's all tactile, and it's such an important part of the whole experience. That something like this is great for these kinds of things. But as far as getting the kids in and getting them to work and creating relationships with them in real time, in real space, cannot be replaced for our areas at all. Yeah. And I think that's the one thing that we've learned over this whole experience is, the learning system online that we are using is great for the academics. It's fantastic, but it will never replace that actual human connection that the arts bring, that nothing else really does.
Yeah, it is. And I think with my show up in New York at the gallery and people coming in to see it, and the weather's been nice, and I've seen other people just going out to see work in person, and I could see there's a joy in that they've been missing this for a long time, and hopefully it'll stay open. But for the time being, it's seeing work in person. There's really nothing for the visual arts. There's really nothing else that compares.
Yeah. So, Joe, I want to thank you for giving us so much of your time tonight.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, for the pre-check early this week. We talked to him for almost an hour on the pre-check too. It's just to get inside this guy's mind has been such a blast.
A learning experience.
And a learning experience. It really is. It's like being with a historian and a documentarian and just an all-in-one and just an all-around great experience to have. And again, Joe, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to someone who I have admired from afar and followed for so many years. And like you said, when you finally get to meet that person, how refreshing it is that they're just a good person.
Yep.
It's so refreshing that we've been lucky. 19 episodes now, MK. We've just 19, We've got great people, not just talented people, but
you guys have done a really great job.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been an honor. And, even for me, these conversations, if I'm talking to students, it's great to talk to other artists like yourselves who are, whatever. It's just, I just miss it too. And so thank you. And I'll just give a shout out to Seaford.
The Vikings. Go Vikings.
Go Vikings. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, like we said, everybody, thanks for tuning in. Like we say at the end of every week, keep looking out for each other, keep pulling for one another, keep loving each other. We don't need to be divided. We don't need to be separate. We really need to come together more now than ever and keep sharing. And it doesn't matter if you're an artist or not. It's just humanity needs it right now. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Joe, again.
Thank you.
Everybody, take care. We'll see you again on the flip side. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, guys.